16 years ago in Sunset Ridge, Arizona, during a violent thunderstorm, two extraordinary births occurred at the exact same moment. Esperanza Flores, born to a struggling single mother, and Justice, a wild Mustang colt born in the hills above town. What followed was an unbreakable bond between girl and horse that defied explanation, until Esperanza's 16th birthday, when both mysteriously vanished without a trace. The desperate search that followed would expose buried family secrets, uncover a conspiracy threatening the Flores family's survival, and reveal how sometimes the most unlikely heroes emerge from the darkest circumstances. This is the story of how a teenage girl and a wild Mustang became the catalyst for justice in a town where the powerful had always silenced the powerless, and how their disappearance would transform an entire community forever. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty main street of Sunset Ridge as Guadalupe Flores burst through the doors of the sheriff's office. Her face streaked with tears and her work uniform from the diner still wrinkled from a sleepless night. Her dark hair hung loose around her shoulders, and her hands trembled as she approached the front desk where Deputy Mike Stevens looked up from his paperwork with concern. "Please, I need to see Sheriff Douglas immediately," Guadalupe said, her voice breaking. "My daughter Esperanza, she's missing. She never came home last night." Deputy Stevens stood quickly, recognizing the urgency in her voice. "Mrs. Flores, let me get the sheriff right away. Please have a seat." The deputy disappeared into the back office while Guadalupe paced nervously near the entrance, checking her phone repeatedly for any missed calls or messages. The small waiting area smelled of coffee and old leather, with wanted posters and community notices covering the bulletin board on the wall. Through the window, she could see the quiet streets of their small town beginning to stir with morning activity. Sheriff Kane Douglas emerged from his office, a tall man with graying temples and kind eyes that had seen too much over his 25 years in law enforcement. He carried a steaming cup of coffee and gestured for Guadalupe to join him in his office, where maps of the surrounding desert covered one wall and filing cabinets lined another. "Mrs. Flores, tell me exactly what happened," Sheriff Douglas said, settling into his chair behind a cluttered desk. "When did you last see Esperanza?" "Yesterday morning around 7, Guadalupe replied, sitting on the edge of the chair across from him. "She was getting ready for school, same as always. She seemed excited because it was her birthday, 16. She'd been talking about it for weeks." The sheriff nodded, pulling out a notepad and pen. "Did she mention any special plans? For after school, anyone she was meeting with?" "She said she might stay after to help with the school's horses," Guadalupe explained. "Esperanza loves working with them. She's always been good with animals, especially horses. But she promised to be home by 6 for dinner. We were going to have a small celebration, just her, me, and her grandfather." Sheriff Douglas looked up from his notes. "And when she didn't come home at 6? "I called the school first, but the office was closed. Then I tried her friend Garrett, but he said he hadn't seen her since lunch. I drove around town looking for her, checked all her usual places." Guadalupe's voice grew more desperate. "I stayed up all night waiting, hoping she would walk through the door with some explanation." The sheriff set down his pen and leaned forward. "Mrs. Flores, I have to ask this. Has Esperanza ever stayed out all night before? Any trouble at home or school that might make her want to run away?" "Never," Guadalupe said firmly. "Esperanza is a good girl. She knows how hard things have been for us, especially with the diner barely making ends meet. She wouldn't worry me like this on purpose." As they spoke, the office door opened and Sergio Flores entered, his weathered face showing the worry of a grandfather who had spent the night searching the desert. His work boots were covered in dust, and his flannel shirt showed evidence of climbing through brush and rocky terrain. "Any word?" he asked immediately, looking between his daughter and the sheriff. "Abuelo has been out looking since before dawn," Guadalupe explained to Sheriff Douglas. "He knows these hills better than anyone." Sergio removed his worn cowboy hat and sat down heavily in the remaining chair. "I checked all the places she likes to go, the old creek bed, the rock formations where she used to play as a child. Nothing, not even a footprint." Sheriff Douglas studied the older man's face. "Mr. Flores, you've lived here your whole life. Where else might a 16-year-old girl go? Somewhere that might not occur to her mother?" Sergio hesitated for a moment, glancing at his daughter before answering. "There's something you need to know about Esperanza, something that might help. Explain where she could be." "What is it, Papa?" Guadalupe asked, turning to her father with surprise. "She's been visiting that wild Mustang up in the canyon. The one they call Justice. Been going up there for months, maybe longer." Sergio's voice was quiet but steady. "I followed her once, saw her talking to that horse like they were old friends." Guadalupe stared at her father in shock. "She never told me about any horse. How could she get close to a wild Mustang? That's dangerous." "Not dangerous for Esperanza," Sergio replied. "That horse knows her. I've never seen anything like it. They have some kind of connection that goes back years." Sheriff Douglas leaned back in his chair, processing this new information. "This Mustang, Justice, where exactly does it roam?" "The high canyon above the Bradshaw Ranch," Sergio answered. "Remote area, hard to reach on foot. But if Esperanza went up there yesterday and something happened..." The sheriff stood and reached for his radio. "Deputy Stevens, I need you to contact Wells Bradshaw and ask about accessing the canyon trail above his property. We may have a search area." As the deputy's voice crackled back with confirmation, Guadalupe felt a chill despite the warming morning air. "You think she's hurt up there?" "I think we need to cover all possibilities," Sheriff Douglas replied diplomatically. "Let me also call Dr. Spencer. She knows more about that Mustang than anyone else in town." The radio buzzed again, and Deputy Stevens' voice filled the small office. "Sheriff, I've got Garrett Ellis here asking to speak with you about Esperanza." "Flores, send him in," the sheriff responded immediately. Moments later, a teenage boy with sandy brown hair and worried blue eyes entered the office. Garrett Ellis was tall for his age, with the lean build of someone who spent most of his free time outdoors. His school backpack hung from one shoulder, and his sneakers showed evidence of a hasty morning run. "Mrs. Flores, Mr. Flores," Garrett said, nodding respectfully to the adults before turning to the sheriff. "I heard about Esperanza being missing. There's something I need to tell you." "What is it, son?" Sheriff Douglas asked, gesturing for Garrett to sit. "Yesterday after school, Esperanza was acting strange, not upset exactly, but like she was planning something important. She kept checking her phone and looking toward the hills." Garrett paused, running his hand through his hair nervously. "She asked me if I thought 16 was old enough to make decisions that adults might not understand." Guadalupe felt her heart sink. "What did you tell her?" "I said it depended on the decision," Garrett replied honestly. "But now I'm worried I said the wrong thing. She hugged me goodbye after last period, which was weird because we never do that. And she said something about how some things are worth the risk." Sheriff Douglas exchanged glances with Sergio. "Did she mention the Mustang to you, Garrett?" The teenager's eyes widened slightly. "You know about Justice? I thought it was supposed to be a secret." "How long have you known about Esperanza's connection to this horse?" the sheriff asked. "About a year," Garrett admitted. "She made me promise not to tell anyone. She said adults wouldn't understand, that they'd try to stop her from visiting, but Justice isn't dangerous, not to her anyway. It's like they're friends or something." The office fell silent as everyone processed this information. Through the window, the sounds of the town waking up continued, but inside the small room, the weight of a missing teenager hung heavy in the air. "I need to organize a search party," Sheriff Douglas announced, standing and reaching for his jacket. "Mrs. Flores, I'll need a recent photo of Esperanza. Mr. Flores, you know the terrain better than my deputies. I'd like you to guide one of the search teams." "Of course," Sergio replied without hesitation. "And Garrett," the sheriff continued, "I may need you to show us exactly where you've seen Esperanza go when she visits this Mustang." As the group prepared to leave the office, Deputy Stevens appeared in the doorway with his radio crackling. "Sheriff, we've got Wells Bradshaw on the line. He says something interesting. That Mustang Justice hasn't been seen on his property for 2 days. Usually shows up every morning at the water tank." The adults looked at each other with growing concern as the implications of this news settled over them. Esperanza and the Mustang had both disappeared around the same time. "Get everyone available out to the canyon," Sheriff Douglas ordered, "and call Dr. Spencer. Tell her to meet us at the Bradshaw Ranch as soon as possible." As they left the sheriff's office and stepped into the bright Arizona morning, none of them could have imagined the journey they were about to embark on, or the secrets that would be revealed before Esperanza and Justice were found. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. The Bradshaw Ranch sprawled across several 100 acres of high desert terrain, with the main house sitting like a fortress against the backdrop of red sandstone cliffs. Wells Bradshaw stood waiting near the ranch gate as Sheriff Douglas's patrol car pulled up the gravel driveway, followed by Guadalupe's aging sedan and Garrett's bicycle. The morning air carried the scent of sage and dust, while the distant sound of cattle lowing echoed across the valley. Wells was a man who commanded attention without trying, his expensive boots and crisp white shirt standing in stark contrast to the work clothes worn by everyone else. His silver hair was perfectly styled despite the early hour, and his hands showed the soft appearance of someone who managed rather than labored. As the group approached, he checked his watch with obvious impatience. "Sheriff Douglas, I hope this won't take long," Wells said, extending his hand in a gesture that seemed more obligatory than welcoming. "I have a conference call with investors at 9. We appreciate your cooperation, Mr. Bradshaw," the sheriff replied diplomatically. "This is Guadalupe and Sergio Flores, the missing girl's family, and Garrett Ellis, her friend." Wells nodded curtly toward the family, but showed little warmth. Terrible situation, of course, though I have to say, teenagers wandering into dangerous terrain isn't uncommon around here. The canyon can be treacherous. Before anyone could respond, a pickup truck approached from the direction of town, raising a cloud of dust as it pulled up beside them. Dr. Beverly Spencer climbed out, her veterinary bag in one hand and a thermos of coffee in the other. She was a woman whose confidence came from years of working with difficult animals and demanding ranchers, her gray-streaked hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. "Sorry I'm late," Dr. Spencer called out, adjusting her wide-brimmed hat against the strengthening sun. "I was finishing up with a difficult carving over at the Morrison place." Sheriff Douglas made quick introductions while Dr. Spencer studied the assembled group with intelligent brown eyes. When she learned about Esperanza's connection to Justice, her expression grew thoughtful. "That explains a lot," she said quietly. "I've been puzzled by Justice's behavior over the past year. He's been much calmer, less aggressive toward humans. I wondered what was causing the change." "You've been tracking this Mustang?" Guadalupe asked, hope flickering in her voice. "For 16 years, Dr. Spencer confirmed. Since the night he was born, actually. Same night as your daughter during that massive thunderstorm. I was here helping with a mare having complications when Justice's mother went into labor up in the canyon." Sergio stepped forward, his weathered face showing interest. "You were here that night?" "I'll never forget it. The storm was so violent that the power went out across the entire valley. I was working by lantern light when we heard the wild mare calling from up in the rocks. Couldn't get to her safely in that weather, but we knew she was giving birth. Wells shifted uncomfortably. Ancient history, Doctor. Let's focus on finding this girl. Dr. Spencer ignored his interruption and continued addressing the Flores family. The timing was remarkable. My watch showed exactly 11:47 p.m. when we heard the Colt's first cry, and later we learned that's the exact minute Esperanza was born at the hospital. That's impossible to verify, Wells said dismissively. Coincidences get exaggerated over time. Actually, it's well documented, Dr. Spencer replied firmly. I made detailed notes in my journal that night, and the hospital records would confirm. The birth time. Garrett had been listening intently, and now he spoke up. Esperanza always said she felt connected to something wild. She never knew about the Mustang being born the same night until she started seeing Justice in the canyon. Sheriff Douglas pulled out his notebook. Dr. Spencer, tell us about Justice's usual patterns. Where does he go? What's his routine? He's territorial, but not aggressive. Stays mostly in the upper canyon where there's year-round water from the springs. Comes down to Wells' property every few days to drink from the stock tank. She pointed toward a metal tank visible in the distance, but he's been absent for 3 days now, which is unusual. 3 days, Guadalupe repeated, but Esperanza only disappeared yesterday. That's why I'm concerned, Dr. Spencer admitted. Justice wouldn't leave his territory unless something forced him to, or unless he was following someone he trusted. Wells checked his watch again with growing irritation. Doctor, you're making this horse sound almost human. It's an animal following instincts. You're wrong about that, Sergio said quietly, speaking for the first time since introductions. I've watched Esperanza with Justice. What they have isn't normal animal behavior. The group began walking toward the canyon trail, following a path that wound upward through scattered juniper trees and rocky outcroppings. The trail was narrow and steep in places, requiring careful footing as they climbed higher above the ranch. Buildings. How did Esperanza first encounter Justice? Sheriff Douglas asked as they hiked. Garrett answered while navigating around a large boulder. She was exploring last summer, maybe 8 months ago. Found him drinking at a hidden spring. Instead of running away, he just stood there watching her. Most wild horses would bolt immediately, Dr. Spencer observed. Especially stallions. They're naturally wary of humans. Justice didn't bolt, Garrett continued. Esperanza said it was like he recognized her. She started talking to him, and he stayed until she was finished. When she came back the next week, he was waiting. They reached a level area where the trail split in 2 directions. Dr. Spencer pointed toward the left fork, which continued upward toward the canyon rim, while the right fork descended toward a grove of cottonwood trees that marked the location of the springs. Justice usually stays near the water, she explained. But if we're looking for clues about where Esperanza might have gone, we should check both directions. Wells had been growing increasingly restless during the climb. Sheriff, I really need to get back for that conference call. You have my permission to search anywhere on the property, but I can't spend the entire morning playing guide. We understand, Mr. Bradshaw, Sheriff Douglas replied. We'll be careful not to disturb your operations. As Wells turned to head back down the trail, Dr. Spencer called after him. Wells, has Brooke mentioned seeing Esperanza around here recently? He paused, looking back with a frown. Why would my daughter have anything to do with this? Brooke rides in these hills, Dr. Spencer explained. She might have seen something. Brooke is away at boarding school, Wells said curtly. She only comes home for holidays. After Wells disappeared down the trail, the remaining group continued toward the springs. The canyon opened up before them, revealing a hidden oasis where clear water bubbled up from underground sources and collected in natural pools surrounded by green vegetation. This is beautiful, Guadalupe whispered, momentarily forgetting her worry as she took in the peaceful scene. Esperanza loves this place, Garrett said. She told me it feels magical, like somewhere that exists outside of normal time. Dr. Spencer knelt beside one of the pools, examining the soft earth around its edge. There are fresh hoof prints here, but they're several days old. And look at this. She pointed to a series of smaller prints in the mud, clearly human and wearing sneakers. The prints led from the water's edge toward a large flat rock that overlooked the entire canyon. Those could be Esperanza's, Guadalupe said, kneeling beside the veterinarian. Sergio had wandered toward the flat rock and was examining something caught on a small shrub nearby. Guadalupe, come look at this. Hanging from a branch at about shoulder height was a small piece of blue fabric, torn as if someone had passed by quickly without noticing the obstacle. That's from her favorite shirt, Guadalupe said immediately, recognizing the distinctive shade. She was wearing it Monday, to school. Sheriff Douglas carefully removed the fabric and placed it in an evidence bag. So, we know she was here recently. The question is, did she leave voluntarily or was she forced to go? Dr. Spencer had continued examining the area around the springs, and now called out from behind a cluster of boulders. I think I found something else. Come look at this. The group gathered around what appeared to be a makeshift shelter constructed from fallen branches and positioned to provide a view of both the springs and the trail leading up from the ranch. Inside the shelter, they discovered a small pile of items that had clearly been placed there intentionally. It's like a hiding place, Garrett observed, crawling inside the shelter. Among the items were a worn notebook with Esperanza's name written on the cover, a small bag of carrots that had begun to wilt, and a water bottle still half full. The notebook was filled with careful observations about Justice's behavior, detailed sketches of the Mustang, and notes about the canyon's wildlife. She's been studying him, Dr. Spencer said, reading over Guadalupe's shoulder as she flipped through the pages. These observations are quite sophisticated for a teenager. One entry, dated just a week earlier, caught everyone's attention. Esperanza had written, "Justice seems restless today." Kept looking toward the eastern canyon, like he was watching for something. Maybe he senses the changes coming. I wish I could protect him from what's going to happen. What changes? Sheriff Douglas asked, looking at the group. What was going to happen? Sergio had grown quiet while examining the notebook, his weathered face showing concern. There's something I haven't told you about Wells Bradshaw and his plans for this land. What kind of plans? Guadalupe asked her father. The kind that would destroy this canyon and everything in it, Sergio replied grimly. The kind that might make a 16-year-old girl desperate enough to do something dangerous to stop them. The group stood in the peaceful canyon, surrounded by the sound of flowing water and birdsong, as the implications of Sergio's words settled over them. Whatever had happened to Esperanza and Justice, it was beginning to look like more than a simple case of a missing teenager. The silence stretched across the canyon as Sergio's words hung in the desert air like a threatening storm cloud. Dr. Spencer looked up from Esperanza's notebook with sharp concern, while Sheriff Douglas moved closer to the older man, recognizing the gravity in his weathered expression. Mr. Flores, what exactly do you know about Wells Bradshaw's plans? The sheriff asked, his voice taking on the careful tone of an experienced investigator. Sergio sat heavily on a nearby boulder, removing his hat to run his fingers through his gray hair. The morning sun had climbed higher, casting harsh shadows across the canyon walls and making the peaceful springs seem almost surreal against the backdrop of their growing worry. 3 weeks ago, I was working late shift maintenance at the county building, Sergio began slowly. I cleaned the offices after hours to make extra money for Guadalupe and Esperanza. I was emptying trash when I heard voices from the planning commission conference room. You were eavesdropping? Guadalupe asked her father with surprise. Not intentionally, Misha. But when I heard Wells Bradshaw mention our family name, I stopped to listen." Sergio's voice grew heavier with each word. He was meeting with developers from Phoenix, big city people with expensive suits and briefcases full of plans. Dr. Spencer closed the notebook and gave Sergio her full attention. "What kind of plans?" "A resort," Sergio said bitterly. "Luxury cabins, golf course, spa facilities. They want to dam up these springs and create an artificial lake for their guests. The whole canyon would be flooded or bulldozed." Sheriff Douglas felt his stomach tighten as the implications became clear. "And the wild horses?" "Gone. All of them." Wells specifically mentioned that the Mustang population would need to be relocated before construction could begin. Sergio looked around the peaceful canyon with sadness. This place where Esperanza found her connection to justice would disappear forever. Garrett had been listening with growing anger, his young face flushed with emotion. "That's why she was acting so strange yesterday. She must have found out somehow." "But how?" Guadalupe asked. "We never discussed this at home." Dr. Spencer was examining the notebook again, flipping to entries from the past few weeks. According to this, Esperanza noticed surveying equipment in the canyon 10 days ago. She wrote about men with instruments taking measurements near the springs. The group studied the entry she had found, written in Esperanza's careful handwriting. "Strange men here today with equipment. Justice was scared and stayed hidden. They put stakes in the ground and took lots of pictures. Something is very wrong. I need to find out what's happening to our place." "Our place," Guadalupe repeated softly. She thought of this canyon as belonging to her and justice. Sheriff Douglas was taking notes rapidly. "Mr. Flores, this meeting you overheard. Did they mention any timeline for the development?" Wells said he needed the land cleared by the end of next month to break ground before winter. He seemed confident there wouldn't be any obstacles. Sergio's voice grew darker. He also mentioned that the Flores family wouldn't be a problem much longer. The words hit Guadalupe like a physical blow. What did he mean by that? "I don't know, but I've been worried ever since. That's part of why I followed Esperanza when she started coming up here. I wanted to make sure she was safe." As they absorbed this disturbing information, the sound of vehicles approaching from below echoed up the canyon walls. Sheriff Douglas looked down the trail and saw dust clouds rising from multiple cars, making their way toward the ranch. "That must be the search teams," he said, reaching for his radio. "Deputy Stevens, what's your location?" The radio crackled to life. "Just arrived at the Bradshaw Ranch with volunteers from town. We've got about 30 people ready to help search. Pastor Stone is here with a group from the church and several of Esperanza's teachers showed up." "Copy that. We're at the springs, in the upper canyon. Found some evidence that confirms Esperanza was here recently. Have the team spread out and search in grids, but tell them to be careful not to contaminate any potential evidence sites." As they prepared to return to the ranch to coordinate with the search teams, Dr. Spencer made one final examination of the area around the springs. Something had been nagging at her since they discovered Esperanza's hideout, and she wanted to be thorough before leaving. "There's something else here," she called out from behind a cluster of rocks near the water's edge. "Hoof prints, but not from Justice. These are from a shod horse, someone riding up here recently." Sheriff Douglas joined her to examine the prints, which were clearly distinct from the unshod marks left by the wild Mustang. "How recent?" "Very. Maybe yesterday or the day before. See how crisp the edges are? And look at this." She pointed to disturbed earth near the prints. "Someone dismounted here and walked around, then remounted and headed back down toward the ranch. So someone else was up here around the time Esperanza disappeared," the sheriff concluded grimly. The group made their way back down the canyon trail, each lost in their own troubling thoughts. The peaceful morning had been shattered by the discovery that Esperanza's disappearance might be connected to forces much larger and more dangerous than a simple teenage adventure gone wrong. When they reached the ranch buildings, they found the area transformed into a bustling command center. Pickup trucks and cars were parked along the access road, and groups of volunteers were gathered around makeshift tables where maps had been spread out for planning search routes. Pastor Abraham Stone, a man whose gentle demeanor belied his strong voice and stronger convictions, approached them immediately. His graying beard and kind eyes had provided comfort to many families during difficult times, and his presence brought a sense of calm to the chaotic scene. "Any news?" he asked Guadalupe, placing a supportive hand on her shoulder. "We found evidence that she was in the canyon recently," Guadalupe replied, "but we also learned some disturbing things about why she might have been up there." Before Pastor Stone could respond, a commotion near the ranch house drew everyone's attention. Wells Bradshaw had emerged from his house and was striding toward the assembled volunteers with obvious displeasure written across his face. "What exactly is going on here?" Wells demanded, addressing Sheriff Douglas but glaring at the crowd of people on his property. "I agreed to let you search, not turn my ranch into a three-ring circus." "These are volunteers helping with the search for Esperanza," Sheriff Douglas explained calmly. "They're all local people who care about finding her safely." "Local people," Wells repeated with barely concealed disdain. "I see the usual collection of busybodies and troublemakers." His eyes stopped on Pastor Stone with particular irritation. "Reverend, I'm surprised to see you here. Don't you have a sermon to prepare?" "Finding a missing child is more important than any sermon," Pastor Stone replied evenly. "The whole community is concerned about Esperanza." Wells turned his attention to Sergio, and his expression grew even colder. "And Mr. Flores, shouldn't you be at work? I'm sure there are buildings that need cleaning somewhere." The insult hung in the air like a slap, and Guadalupe felt her face flush with anger. "My father is helping search for his granddaughter. He has every right to be here." "Of course he does," Wells said with false sympathy, "though I have to wonder if family problems might be responsible for this situation. Teenage girls from certain backgrounds often act out when they don't receive proper supervision." Sheriff Douglas stepped forward before anyone could respond to the obvious prejudice in Wells' words. "Mr. Bradshaw, we appreciate your cooperation with the search. However, I need to ask you some questions about activities on your property." "What kind of activities?" Wells asked, his tone becoming defensive. "Surveying work in the canyon. When did that take place, and who authorized it?" Wells hesitated for just a moment before answering. "Routine boundary surveys. Property owners have the right to know exactly where their landlines are located. According to our information, the springs and Upper Canyon are actually on federal land managed by the Forest Service," Dr. Spencer interjected. "Private surveying there would require permits." "I think you're mistaken about the boundaries," Wells replied stiffly. "But this isn't the time for property disputes. We should focus on finding the missing girl." As if summoned by the tension in the conversation, a black SUV with tinted windows pulled up the ranch driveway and parked near the house. Two men in expensive suits emerged, both carrying briefcases and looking distinctly out of place among the ranch setting and search volunteers. Wells glanced at the SUV with what appeared to be annoyance. "Gentlemen, this isn't a good time. We'll have to reschedule." The taller of the two men approached Wells and spoke quietly, but Sheriff Douglas was close enough to catch fragments of their conversation. He heard mentions of timeline, complications, and handling the situation. Pastor Stone had also overheard parts of the exchange, and he moved closer to Guadalupe and Sergio. "I think we need to talk privately," he said quietly. "There are things about this situation that you need to know." As the morning progressed and search teams spread out across the rugged terrain, it became increasingly clear that Esperanza's disappearance was not a simple case of a teenager getting lost in the desert. The convergence of land development plans, family struggles, and a community's growing awareness of injustice was creating a storm that would test everyone involved. In the distance, the canyon where Esperanza had found her connection to justice remained silent, keeping its secrets while the search for answers continued below. Pastor Stone guided Guadalupe, Sergio, and Garrett away from the main group of searchers, leading them toward a grove of mesquite trees that provided privacy from both the volunteers and Wells Bradshaw's watchful presence. The pastor's usually calm demeanor showed cracks of urgency as he checked over his shoulder to ensure they weren't being overheard. "What I'm about to tell you must stay between us for now," Pastor Stone said, his voice low but intense. "2 weeks ago, Esperanza came to see me at the church. She was upset, crying, and needed someone to talk to." Guadalupe felt her heart constrict. "She never mentioned visiting you. What was wrong?" She had discovered something that frightened her. Not just the surveying in the canyon, but documents she found that showed the scope of what Wells Bradshaw is planning. Pastor Stone paused, watching as another search team headed up a different trail. She had been doing research at the county offices after school, trying to understand what the surveyors were doing. Sergio leaned forward intently. "What kind of documents?" "Environmental impact assessments, water rights transfers, federal land, lease applications. Esperanza is much smarter than people give her credit for. She pieced together that the resort project would require rerouting the entire water supply for this part of the county. That would affect everyone's wells and irrigation." Sergio said, understanding the implications immediately. "Exactly, but there's more. Esperanza discovered that several families, including yours, have been targeted for property tax reassessments that would force them to sell their land." Pastor Stone's expression grew grimmer. She found correspondence suggesting these reassessments weren't random. Garrett had been listening with growing amazement. "Esperanza figured all this out by herself? She's been investigating for months. She showed me folders full of copied documents, photographs, even recordings she made with her phone." Pastor Stone turned to Guadalupe. "Your daughter was building a case to expose the entire scheme." The weight of this revelation settled over them as they realized how much danger Esperanza might have placed herself in. The innocent teenager they thought they knew had been conducting a sophisticated investigation that threatened powerful interests. "Where are these documents now?" Sheriff Douglas asked, having approached quietly during the conversation. Pastor Stone looked uncomfortable. "Esperanza kept them hidden. She said it wasn't safe to store them at home or at the church. She was afraid someone might break in to steal or destroy the evidence." "Did she tell you where she hid them?" the sheriff pressed. "No, but she mentioned a place that was special to her and Justice, somewhere only they knew about." Pastor Stone looked toward the canyon. "She said if anything happened to her, Justice would know where to find the truth." Sheriff Douglas felt a chill despite the warming desert air. "Pastor, when you say if anything happened to her, was Esperanza expecting trouble?" "She was terrified. Said she'd seen cars following her home from school. Someone had been asking questions about her at the diner where her mother works." Pastor Stone glanced at Guadalupe apologetically. "She made me promise not to worry you unless she disappeared." "Cars following her," Guadalupe said, her voice rising with panic. "Why didn't she tell me?" Before Pastor Stone could answer, the sound of raised voices drew their attention back toward the ranch buildings. Wells Bradshaw was arguing with one of the search coordinators, his face red with anger as he gestured emphatically. "I've been patient long enough. Wells was saying loudly enough for everyone to hear. "This is private property and I have important business to conduct. The search needs to move off my land immediately." Dr. Spencer stepped forward from the group of volunteers. "Mr. Bradshaw, a 16-year-old girl is missing. Surely your business can wait a few hours." "My business cannot wait," Wells snapped back, "and I'm beginning to think this whole search is unnecessary drama. Teenage girls run away from home all the time, especially when they come from unstable households." The insult sparked immediate anger among the volunteers. Several of Esperanza's teachers moved forward, their faces showing indignation at Wells' callous words. "Esperanza is not from an unstable household," declared Mrs. Angela Foster, Esperanza's English teacher. "She's one of the most responsible students I've ever taught, and one of the smartest," added Coach Taylor. "That girl has more integrity in her little finger than most adults have in their entire bodies." Wells looked around at the assembled volunteers with clear disdain. "Yes, well, you're all entitled to your opinions, but this is still my property." Sheriff Douglas approached the group with his official authority evident in his bearing. "Mr. Bradshaw, I need to ask you directly. Do you know anything about Esperanza Flores' disappearance?" "Of course not," Wells replied, but his answer came too quickly and with too much defensiveness. "Then you won't mind if we expand our search to include all areas of your property, including the buildings and any storage facilities?" Wells' face darkened. "You'll need a warrant for that, Sheriff." "I can get one," Sheriff Douglas replied evenly, "but it would be much easier if you simply gave us permission to conduct a thorough search." The tension between the two men was palpable as Wells considered his options. Around them, the volunteers had grown quiet, sensing that something important was happening in this confrontation. "Fine," Wells said finally, "but make it quick and don't disturb my livestock or equipment." As search teams began to organize for a more systematic examination of the ranch buildings, Alejandro Guerrero arrived in a dust-covered pickup truck that had obviously been driven hard across rough terrain. The horse trainer climbed out slowly, his weathered face showing exhaustion and concern. "Any sign of them?" Dr. Spencer called out as Alejandro approached. "I found tracks," he replied, pulling off his hat to wipe sweat from his forehead. "About 5 miles east of here, in the high country. Justice's prints clear as day, but he wasn't alone." Sheriff Douglas immediately gave Alejandro his full attention. "What do you mean?" "There were 2 horses, Justice and another shod horse. They were traveling together, not one chasing the other." Alejandro's experienced eyes met the sheriff's. "Someone was riding with that Mustang." "Could it have been Esperanza?" Guadalupe asked desperately. Alejandro shook his head slowly. "The shod horse was too big, and the rider was too heavy. Boot prints in the soft ground showed a man's size, maybe size 11 or 12. This news sent a ripple of worry through the assembled volunteers. If someone had been with Justice, and if that someone was not Esperanza, then where was she? "Which direction were they heading?" Sheriff Douglas asked. "North, toward the old mining claims in the hills above Copper Creek. Remote country, hard to reach except on horseback." Alejandro looked around the group grimly. If someone took the girl up there, they could hide for weeks without being found. Wells Bradshaw had been listening to this exchange with growing agitation. "This is ridiculous speculation. You're all assuming the worst when there could be perfectly innocent explanations." "What innocent explanation would you suggest?" "Doctor," Spencer asked sharply, "maybe the girl is fine and doesn't want to be found. Maybe she's tired of living in poverty and decided to seek a better life elsewhere." Wells' words were cruel and calculated to hurt. It wouldn't be the first time someone from her background made that choice. The silence that followed Wells's statement was broken by Sergio Flores, speaking in a voice that carried the dignity of a man who had worked hard his entire life to provide for his family. "Mr. Bradshaw, you don't know my granddaughter, And you don't know our family. Esperanza would never abandon her responsibilities or cause us this kind of worry. If she's missing, it's because someone has taken her or because she's in danger. Perhaps, Wells replied with false sympathy, but you have to admit that your family has been under a lot of financial pressure lately. Sometimes desperate people make desperate choices. The cruelty in his words was unmistakable, and it galvanized the entire group of volunteers. These were people who had known the Flores family for years, who had seen their struggles and their strength, who understood the bonds of love that held them together. Pastor Stone stepped forward, his voice carrying the moral authority of his position. Mr. Bradshaw, your words are inappropriate and hurtful. This family deserves our support and compassion, not our judgment. I agree, said Mrs. Foster firmly. The Flores family has contributed more to this community than you know. As the confrontation escalated, Sheriff Douglas noticed that the two businessmen who had arrived earlier were now standing near Wells's house, talking on cell phones and watching the search activities with obvious concern. Something about their presence felt wrong, and he made a mental note to find out who they were and why their business with Wells couldn't wait. The morning sun continued its climb toward its peak, and the desert heat was beginning to build. Somewhere, in the vast landscape of canyons and hills, Esperanza and Justice remained missing, while the community that loved them struggled to understand what forces had torn them away. Sheriff Douglas made a decision that would change the trajectory of the entire investigation. Walking deliberately toward the two businessmen near Wells's house, he pulled out his badge and notebook, his official demeanor making it clear this was not a casual conversation. Gentlemen, I'm Sheriff Kane Douglas. I need to see some identification and ask what brings you to Mr. Bradshaw's property during a missing person investigation. The taller man, immaculately dressed despite the desert heat, exchanged a quick glance with his companion before reaching into his jacket. I'm Richard Dalton, Executive Vice President of Desert Vista Development Corporation. This is my associate, Mark Stevens. Sheriff Douglas examined their business cards carefully, noting the Phoenix address and the expensive quality of the cardstock. And your business here today? Time-sensitive real estate matters, Dalton replied smoothly. We had scheduled this meeting weeks ago. Real estate matters that can't be postponed while we search for a missing teenager? The sheriff asked, his tone carrying clear skepticism. Mark Stevens, a younger man with nervous energy, spoke up before Dalton could respond. We're actually here about expanding the search area. Our company has detailed topographical surveys of the region that might help locate the girl. Sheriff Douglas studied Stevens carefully, noting the slight tremor in his voice and the way his eyes avoided direct contact. That's very generous. I'd like to see those surveys. Dalton stepped forward quickly. Of course, but they're back at our Phoenix office. We could have them couriered here by this afternoon. Or we could drive to Phoenix and get them now, Sheriff Douglas suggested. How far is your office? The two men exchanged another glance, this one longer and more meaningful. That won't be necessary, Dalton said finally. We can arrange for digital copies to be emailed within the hour. As the sheriff continued questioning the businessman, Alejandro Guerrero was organizing a mounted search party to follow the tracks he had discovered. Dr. Spencer had volunteered to join the group, along with 3 experienced riders from neighboring ranches who had arrived with their horses and trailers. The terrain gets rough once we leave the main trails, Alejandro explained to the mounted volunteers. We'll need to move carefully to avoid losing the tracks or injuring the horses. Guadalupe approached the group as they prepared to depart. Please, I want to come with you. Mrs. Flores, this could be dangerous, Dr. Spencer said gently. We don't know what we'll find up there. She's my daughter, Guadalupe replied firmly. I need to be there when you find her. Sergio appeared beside his daughter, leading a saddled horse from the ranch stable. Guadalupe has been riding since she was a child. She can handle herself in the mountains. Alejandro studied mother and daughter for a moment, recognizing the determination in their faces. "You'll follow my lead and do exactly what I say. If I tell you to stay back or return to safety, you don't argue." As the mounted search party prepared to leave, Garrett Ellis approached Sheriff Douglas with obvious agitation. "Sheriff, there's something else about yesterday that I just remembered." "What is it, son?" "When Esperanza hugged me goodbye at school, she slipped something into my backpack. I thought it was just a note or something, but I forgot about it until now." Garrett was already pulling off his backpack and digging through the contents. "Here it is." He handed the sheriff a small digital camera, the kind teenagers used before smartphones became common. "She told me to keep it safe, but she didn't say." "Why?" Sheriff Douglas turned on the camera and began scrolling through the stored images. What he saw made his blood run cold. The photos showed detailed documentation of the surveying activity in the canyon, but more importantly, they showed clear images of the men conducting the surveys. "Garrett, has anyone else seen these photos?" "I don't think so. I didn't even know I had the camera until just now." One photo in particular caught the sheriff's attention. It showed a man in expensive clothes directing the surveying team, and that man was clearly Mark Stevens, one of the businessmen currently talking with Wells Bradshaw. "Mrs. Foster," Sheriff Douglas called to Esperanza's English teacher, "I need you to take Garrett somewhere safe and make sure he stays there until I can speak with him further." "What's wrong?" Mrs. Foster asked, noting the urgency in the sheriff's voice. "Just do it, please, and don't let anyone else know about this camera." As Mrs. Foster led Garrett toward her car, Sheriff Douglas returned to confront the businessmen, but found that both Dalton and Stevens had disappeared. Wells Bradshaw was standing alone near his house, his face showing irritation and something that might have been fear. "Where did your associates go?" Sheriff Douglas demanded. "They had to return to Phoenix for an urgent meeting," Wells replied, but his answer sounded rehearsed. "I need to speak with them immediately. How can I reach them?" Wells hesitated for just a moment too long. "I'll have to get their contact information from my office." Meanwhile, the mounted search party had begun following Alejandro's tracks eastward into increasingly rugged terrain. The trail led through a series of narrow canyons where the horses had to pick their way carefully around boulders and loose rock. Dr. Spencer rode beside Guadalupe, both women scanning the landscape for any sign of Esperanza or Justice. The veterinarian's trained eye caught details that others might miss, and she had been growing increasingly concerned about what they might find. "The tracks are fresher than I first thought," Alejandro called back to the group. "Maybe 18 hours old, no more." "That means they passed through here sometime yesterday evening," Dr. Spencer calculated. "After Esperanza was reported missing, they crested a ridge that provided a panoramic view of the surrounding mountains, and Alejandro suddenly raised his hand to signal a stop. In the distance, barely visible through a gap between two hills, they could see smoke rising from what appeared to be a campfire. "There," he said quietly, pointing toward the smoke. "Someone's up there." Guadalupe felt her heart leap with hope and terror. "Could it be Esperanza?" "We'll find out," Alejandro replied, but his expression remained grim. "Everyone stay quiet and follow my lead. If this is who I think it might be, we need to be very careful." Back at the ranch, Sheriff Douglas had discovered that Wells Bradshaw's cooperation was evaporating rapidly. When pressed for contact information for the Phoenix businessman, Wells claimed he needed to retrieve their cards from his locked office and would provide the information shortly. "I don't have time for delays," Sheriff Douglas stated firmly. "A girl's life may be in danger." "Sheriff, you're overreacting," Wells replied. "Those men are legitimate businessmen with no connection to this missing person case. Then why did one of them lie about never being in the canyon before?" Sheriff Douglas held up the digital camera. "I have photographs proving Mark Stevens was directing survey operations in the same area where Esperanza disappeared. Wells's face went pale, and for the first time since the search began, he appeared genuinely rattled. "I don't know what you're talking about." "I think you know exactly what I'm talking about. The question is whether you're going to cooperate with this investigation, or whether I need to get a warrant and search every inch of your property." Before Wells could respond, his house phone began ringing persistently. He glanced toward the sound with obvious anxiety, but made no move to answer. "Aren't you going to get that?" Sheriff Douglas asked. "It's probably not important," Wells said, but the phone continued ringing with an urgency that suggested otherwise. Pastor Stone had been observing this exchange from a distance, and now he approached the sheriff with a troubled expression. "Sheriff, there's something else Esperanza told me that I think you need to know." "What is it?" "She said she had figured out a way to save Justice and the canyon, but it would require her to be very brave. She asked me to pray for her courage to do the right thing, even if it meant putting herself at risk." The implications of Pastor Stone's words hit Sheriff Douglas like a physical blow. "Are you saying she might have deliberately put herself in danger?" "I think she discovered something that she believed would stop the development project, but getting that information required her to take a dangerous chance." As the afternoon sun climbed higher and the search efforts intensified, the true scope of what 16-year-old Esperanza Flores had uncovered was beginning to emerge. Her investigation into Wells Bradshaw's development plans had apparently revealed connections and corruption that reached far beyond a simple land grab. In the mountains above, the mounted search party continued their careful approach toward the distant smoke, not knowing whether they would find Esperanza safe or discover evidence of something far more sinister. The wild Mustang Justice remained missing, along with the girl who had loved him, and time was running out to bring them both home safely. The mounted search party approached the source of the smoke with careful precision, their horses' hooves, finding quiet purchase on the rocky ground as they navigated through a maze of boulders and stunted pine trees. Alejandro held up his hand frequently to pause their advance, listening for sounds that might indicate who or what lay ahead. Dr. Spencer rode close behind him, her veterinary experience making her acutely aware of how the horses were reacting to their surroundings. The animals showed signs of nervousness, ears forward and nostrils flaring as they detected scents carried on the mountain breeze. "The horses smell something," she whispered to Alejandro. "Something that has them spooked." Guadalupe's mare danced, sideways nervously, and she tightened her grip on the reins while straining to see through the trees ahead. Every muscle in her body was tense with the desperate hope that they would find Esperanza safe, and the equally terrifying possibility that they might discover something else entirely. As they crested a small rise, the scene below them came into view. A makeshift camp had been established in a natural clearing, with a smoldering fire surrounded by camping equipment that looked expensive and out of place in the wilderness setting. 2 horses were tied to a rope line stretched between trees, and one of them was unmistakably Justice. The wild Mustang stood with his magnificent head held high, his coat gleaming in the filtered sunlight. But something was wrong with the scene. Justice appeared to be favoring his left front leg, and there were rope marks visible around his neck and legs, where he had obviously been restrained against his will. "There's Justice," Guadalupe breathed. "But where's Esperanza?" Alejandro studied the camp through binoculars, his weathered face growing increasingly grim as he observed the details. "I see movement in that tent, but I can't tell who or how many people are down there." The other horse tied near Justice was clearly the source of the shod prints they had been following. It was a well-bred quarter horse with expensive tack, the kind of mount that belonged to someone with significant resources. Dr. Spencer had pulled out her own binoculars and was examining Justice's condition with professional concern. "That Mustang has been mistreated. I can see rope burns and what looks like whip marks on his flanks. Someone has been trying to break him forcibly." The implications of this discovery sent a chill through the entire search party. If Justice had been captured and abused, what might have happened to Esperanza? "We need to get closer," Guadalupe said, her voice tight with maternal desperation. "Not yet," Alejandro cautioned. "We don't know how many people are down there or whether they're armed. One wrong move could make this situation much worse." As they debated their next course of action, the tent flap opened and a figure emerged that made Guadalupe gasp with recognition. It was Brooke Bradshaw, Wells's daughter, who was supposed to be away at boarding school. But instead of the privileged teenager they expected to see, Brooke appeared disheveled and frightened, her expensive riding clothes torn and dirty. "That's Wells's daughter," Dr. Spencer said in amazement. "What is she doing up here?" Before anyone who could answer, a second figure emerged from the tent, and this one made everyone's blood run cold. It was Mark Stevens, one of the businessmen from the development company, but now he appeared completely different from his earlier polished appearance. His expensive suit had been replaced by rugged outdoor clothing, and he carried what appeared to be a rifle. Stevens grabbed Brooke roughly by the arm and spoke to her in harsh tones that carried up to the watching search party, though the specific words were lost in the distance. "He's holding her prisoner too," Alejandro observed grimly. "But where's Esperanza?" Guadalupe asked desperately. Their question was answered when Stevens walked to the tied horses and yanked on a rope that was connected to something behind Justice. As the Mustang moved aside, they could see a third figure seated on the ground, with her hands tied behind her back. Even from a distance, there was no mistaking Esperanza's dark hair and slight build. Guadalupe nearly cried out with relief and terror, but Alejandro clamped a firm hand on her arm to keep her quiet. "We need to get help," he whispered urgently. "This is beyond what we can handle alone." Meanwhile, back at the Bradshaw Ranch, Sheriff Douglas was methodically dismantling Wells's attempts at deception. The persistent phone calls had finally stopped, but Wells's anxiety had continued to increase with each passing minute. "Mr. Bradshaw, I'm going to ask you one more time. Where are your business associates, and what is their real connection to Esperanza Flores's disappearance?" Wells had abandoned his earlier pretense of cooperation and now stood with his arms crossed defensively. "I don't have to answer your questions without a lawyer present." "That's your right," Sheriff Douglas agreed. "But your lack of cooperation is only making you look more suspicious. A 16-year-old girl is missing, and you seem more concerned about protecting your business interests than helping us find her." Pastor Stone had been listening to this exchange while coordinating with the remaining search volunteers, and now he approached the sheriff with a troubled expression. "Sheriff, I just received a call from Courtney Lewis, the social worker. She says there have been irregularities in the county tax assessment office, specifically targeting families like the Flores. Someone has been manipulating property values to force sales. What kind of irregularities? Assessments being tripled overnight, environmental violations being cited for properties that have no environmental issues, permit requirements being imposed retroactively." Pastor Stone's voice grew angrier with each word. "All targeting families who can't afford to fight the system legally." Sheriff Douglas felt pieces of a larger puzzle beginning to fall into place. "And these families just happen to own property that would be valuable for resort development." "Exactly. Courtney thinks Esperanza uncovered evidence of systematic corruption in the county government offices." Wells Bradshaw had been listening to this conversation with growing agitation, and now he spoke up with obvious desperation. "You're all making wild accusations based on conspiracy theories. There's no evidence of any corruption." "Actually, there is," Sheriff Douglas replied, holding up the digital camera again. These photos show survey work being conducted without proper permits on federal land. They also show county officials participating in activities that were never approved by the Planning Commission. The radio on Sheriff Douglas's belt crackled to life with an urgent transmission from Alejandro. "Sheriff, we've found them. Esperanza and Justice are both alive, but they're being held captive by armed men in the mountains above Copper Creek. We need backup immediately." The relief that flooded through the group of volunteers was palpable, but it was quickly replaced by new concern when Alejandro continued his report. "The situation is more complicated than we thought. There are multiple captives, and the perpetrators are armed. We need a tactical response team and medical support." Wells Bradshaw's face had gone completely white during this radio transmission, and now he sank heavily into a nearby chair as if his legs could no longer support him. "Sheriff," Alejandro's voice continued over the radio, "one of the captives appears to be Brooke Bradshaw. You need to know that the main perpetrator is Mark Stevens from the development company." The final piece of Wells' deception crumbled as everyone turned to stare at him. The realization that his own daughter was involved in this situation seemed to break his remaining resistance to cooperation. "I never meant for anyone to get hurt," Wells said quietly, his earlier arrogance completely gone. "It was supposed to be a simple business transaction." "What was supposed to be simple?" Sheriff Douglas demanded. "The land acquisition. Mark said he could handle any obstacles quietly and efficiently. I never imagined he would resort to kidnapping." "Pastor." Stone stepped forward with barely controlled anger. "You're talking about people's homes and livelihoods as if they were just obstacles to be removed." "And what about justice?" Dr. Spencer added furiously. "Did you know they were planning to capture and abuse that Mustang?" Wells looked genuinely surprised at this question. "The horses were supposed to be relocated humanely. Mark assured me that proper wildlife management protocols would be followed." "Proper protocols don't include whip marks and rope burns," Dr. Spencer replied sharply. Sheriff Douglas was already coordinating with state police and requesting emergency backup when his radio crackled again with Alejandro's voice. "Sheriff, Stevens is moving the captives. It looks like he's preparing to leave the camp. If we're going to intercept them, it has to be soon." The race against time had begun. In the mountains above Sunset Ridge, Esperanza and Justice waited for rescue. While their captor grew increasingly desperate, below in the valley, a community that had rallied to support the Flores family prepared for the final confrontation that would determine whether justice would prevail over greed and corruption. As Sheriff Douglas organized the response effort, he realized that 16-year-old Esperanza Flores had accomplished something remarkable. Her courage and determination to protect the canyon and its wild inhabitants had exposed a web of corruption that reached from local government offices to powerful development corporations. Now it remained to be seen whether that courage would be enough to save her life and the life of the Mustang, who had shared her birthday and her destiny. State police helicopters thundered across the desert sky toward the mountains, while Sheriff Douglas coordinated the rescue operation from the Bradshaw ranch. The quiet morning had transformed into a command center, buzzing with law enforcement personnel, emergency medical teams, and federal agents who had arrived after learning about the illegal activities on government land. Wells Bradshaw sat in his own kitchen, no longer the arrogant landowner who had dismissed the search efforts hours earlier. With his daughter's life hanging in the balance, his resistance had completely crumbled, and he was providing investigators with detailed information about the development conspiracy. "Mark Stevens isn't just a businessman," Wells explained to FBI agent Sarah Martinez, who had taken over coordination of the federal aspects of the case. "He's what they call a problem solver for development companies. When legitimate acquisition methods fail, he uses other approaches." "What kind of Other approaches? Agent Martinez asked, her pen moving rapidly across her notepad. Intimidation, harassment, property damage. I thought that was as far as it went. Wells ran his hands through his silver hair, his earlier composure completely gone. When he mentioned that obstacles would be removed efficiently, I assumed he meant legal and financial pressure. Courtney Lewis, the social worker, had arrived with boxes of documents that supported the corruption allegations. She spread files across Wells's dining room table, showing the pattern of targeting that had affected dozens of families throughout the county. The Flores family wasn't the only target, she explained to Sheriff Douglas. Every property owner between here and Copper Creek received inflated tax assessments, environmental citations, or permit violations, all within the past 6 months, and all designed to force sales at below-market prices, Agent Martinez observed, studying the documentation. Pastor Stone had been coordinating with the community volunteers who remained at the ranch, keeping them informed, while ensuring they stayed clear of the law enforcement operation. Mrs. Foster sat with Garrett Ellis, who was still shaken by the realization that his best friend had been conducting a dangerous investigation without his knowledge. I should have known something was wrong, Garrett said for the 5th time. Esperanza was acting so secretive lately. You couldn't have known, Mrs. Foster replied gently. Esperanza was protecting you by not involving you in something so dangerous. Meanwhile, in the mountains above, the rescue operation was proceeding with military precision. Alejandro had guided the tactical team to within sight of Stevens' camp, where they could observe the situation through high-powered scopes and plan their approach. Special Agent Tom Bradley, Sheriff Douglas' nephew, and a member of the state police. Tactical unit studied the camp layout through binoculars while communicating with his team via radio. Target has moved the captives closer to the horses, he reported quietly. Appears to be preparing for immediate departure. The teenage girl with dark hair is showing signs of injury to her left ankle. Dr. Spencer had insisted on joining the rescue team despite the danger, arguing that Justice's behavior could be crucial to the operation's success. She positioned herself where she could observe the Mustang while staying hidden from Stevens's view. Justice is agitated but not panicked, she reported to Agent Bradley. The Mustang recognizes Esperanza's distress and is trying to position himself between her and Stevens. That could work in our favor. In the camp below, Mark Stevens had become increasingly paranoid as the day progressed. He paced around the captives with the rifle cradled in his arms, frequently checking his watch and scanning the surrounding hills for signs of pursuit. This wasn't supposed to happen, he muttered, more to himself than to his prisoners. The girl should have minded her own business. Esperanza sat with her hands tied, her ankle throbbing from a fall she had taken while trying to escape during the night. Despite her pain and fear, her eyes remained focused on Justice, who stood as close as his restraints would allow. Mr. Stevens, she said quietly, you don't have to do this. Let Brooke go. She's not part of whatever you're trying to accomplish. Stevens whirled toward her, his face showing the strain of a man whose carefully laid plans had gone completely wrong. Shut up. You've already caused enough trouble with your little investigation. Brooke Bradshaw, who had been silent since the search party first spotted the camp, finally spoke up. Mark, my father will pay whatever you want. Just let us go. Your father is the reason we're in this mess, Stevens replied harshly. If he had been honest about the complications from the beginning, none of this would have been necessary. What complications? Esperanza asked, still trying to understand how Brooke had become involved. Stevens laughed bitterly. Princess here discovered Daddy's business plans and threatened to expose everything unless the wild horses were protected. She was going to run to the media, ruin years of careful planning. The revelation that Brooke had also been trying to protect Justice created a strange moment of connection between the two teenage captives. Despite their different backgrounds and previous rivalry, they had both risked their safety for the same cause. "So you kidnapped your business partner's daughter?" Esperanza said with disbelief. "I convinced her to meet me in the canyon to discuss alternatives," Stevens corrected. "She came willingly, thinking we were going to negotiate a compromise. When she realized my real intentions, she tried to run." Back at the ranch, Wells Bradshaw was learning about his daughter's secret efforts to protect the Mustangs with a mixture of pride and horror. Agent Martinez had discovered that Brooke had been in contact with environmental groups and wildlife protection organizations, gathering support to challenge the development project. "She never said anything to me about caring for wild horses," Wells said quietly. "Teenage children often have stronger moral convictions than their parents realize," Pastor Stone observed, "especially when they see injustice being committed." The radio crackled with an update from the tactical team. "Stevens is saddling the horses. It appears he's planning to take the captives deeper into the mountains. We need to move now before he reaches terrain where helicopters can't follow." Agent Martinez made the decision to authorize the rescue attempt. "All units, you are cleared to proceed. Priority is the safety of the hostages." High above the camp, the tactical team began their careful descent, while Justice sensed the approaching change in the situation. The Mustang's nostrils flared as he detected unfamiliar scents carried on the mountain breeze, and his posture shifted from resignation to alertness. Dr. Spencer had been right about Justice's protective instincts toward Esperanza. As Stevens approached with a saddle for the Mustang, Justice positioned himself directly between the man and the girl, his ears flattened against his head in warning. "Get that animal under control," Stevens ordered, raising his rifle threateningly. "He won't hurt you if you don't threaten us," Esperanza said quickly, recognizing the dangerous escalation in Stevens' behavior. But Justice had no intention of being saddled by someone who had abused him. When Stevens moved closer with the saddle, the Mustang reared up on his hind legs, his front hooves striking the air in a display that had intimidated predators for millions of years. Stevens stumbled backward, temporarily distracted by the powerful animal's defiance, and in that moment of inattention, the tactical team struck. "Police! Drop your weapon!" Agent Bradley's voice echoed across the camp as armed officers emerged from concealment on three sides. Stevens spun around with the rifle still in his hands, his face showing the desperation of a man who had run out of options. For a terrifying moment, it appeared he might choose to fight rather than surrender, but Justice had other plans. The Mustang, freed from immediate threat, turned his attention to the ropes that bound Esperanza. Using his teeth with surprising delicacy, he began working at the knots while keeping his body between her and Stevens. "Don't move!" Agent Bradley shouted as Stevens hesitated with the rifle half raised. The standoff lasted only seconds, but those seconds felt like hours to everyone involved. Then Stevens' shoulders sagged in defeat, and he let the rifle fall to the ground as officers rushed forward to secure him. As paramedics attended to Esperanza's injured ankle and both teenage captives were checked for other injuries, Dr. Spencer approached Justice with slow, careful movements. The Mustang allowed her to examine his wounds while maintaining his protective position near Esperanza. "You did good, boy," she whispered to the horse. "You protected her when no one else could." The rescue operation had succeeded, but as helicopters prepared to evacuate the injured to the hospital, everyone involved understood that the real work of bringing justice to Sunset Ridge was just beginning. Desert View Hospital buzzed with activity as emergency helicopters delivered the rescued captives, and news crews gathered outside to cover the breaking story. Esperanza lay in a hospital bed with her ankle properly splintered, surrounded by family members who had barely left her side since her arrival 3 hours earlier. Guadalupe held her daughter's hand while Sergio sat in the corner chair, his weathered pace showing the emotional toll of the past 24 hours. The relief of having Esperanza safe was overwhelming, but they were still processing the magnitude of what their 16-year-old daughter had uncovered. "Mija, you scared us so badly," Guadalupe said softly, brushing Esperanza's hair away from her face. "When we realized you were missing, I thought I might lose you forever." "I'm sorry, Mama," Esperanza replied, her voice still hoarse from her ordeal. "But I couldn't let them destroy the canyon and hurt Justice. Someone had to stop them. Dr. Amanda Rodriguez, the emergency room physician, entered the room with Esperanza's chart and a gentle smile. "The X-rays show a mild sprain, nothing that won't heal completely with rest and physical therapy. You're very lucky, young lady." "What about Justice?" Esperanza asked immediately. "Is he okay?" "Dr. Spencer is treating him at the large animal facility across town," Dr. Rodriguez explained. "She says his injuries will heal, but it will take time and patience to help him overcome the trauma of his captivity." In the room next door, Brooke Bradshaw sat with her own injuries being tended. While her father struggled with emotions he had never expected to feel, Wells had spent his adult life viewing people as either assets or obstacles to his business goals, but seeing his daughter's courage had shattered his cynical worldview. "I'm proud of you," he said quietly, the words feeling strange in his mouth. "I never realized you cared so deeply about anything beyond your social life and school." Brooke looked at her father with eyes that seemed older than her 17 years. "I care about a lot of things, Dad. I just never thought you'd listen if I tried to tell you." "I'm listening now," Wells replied, though they both knew it might be too late to repair the damage his choices had caused. Sheriff Douglas entered Brooke's room with Agent Martinez, both carrying notebooks and wearing the serious expressions of investigators who still had work to complete. "Miss Bradshaw, we need to ask you some questions about your involvement in this situation," Agent Martinez said gently. "We understand you were trying to protect the wild horses, but we need to understand the timeline of events." "I found out about the development project 2 months ago," Brooke explained, glancing nervously at her father. "I overheard a phone conversation where Dad was discussing relocating the Mustang herds. When I researched what that really meant, I realized they were planning to kill them." Wells winced at his daughter's blunt assessment, but didn't contradict her. "So you contacted environmental groups?" Sheriff Douglas asked. "I reached out to the Wild Horse Protection Alliance and several others. They told me I needed documentation and evidence to build a legal case." Brooke's voice grew stronger as she continued. "That's when I started spending time in the canyon, taking photographs and learning about Justice's behavior patterns." "Did you know Esperanza was conducting her own investigation?" Agent Martinez asked. "Not until last week, when I saw her taking pictures of the survey equipment. We realized we were working toward the same goal from different directions." The two teenagers had planned to combine their evidence and present it to authorities together, but Stevens had discovered Brooke's activities and lured her to the canyon under the pretense of negotiating a compromise. "He told me he wanted to find a solution that would protect some of the horses while still allowing development to proceed," Brooke continued. "I was naive enough to believe him." Meanwhile, in the county jail, Mark Stevens was learning that his legal situation was far worse than he had imagined. Federal charges for kidnapping, assault, and illegal activities on government land were being joined by state charges for conspiracy, extortion, and animal cruelty. Detective Frank Cooper from the State Attorney General's office sat across from Stevens in the interview room, laying out the evidence that had been gathered during the investigation. "Mr. Stevens, we have photographic evidence of your illegal surveying activities, witness testimony placing you at the scene of multiple crimes, and physical evidence connecting you to the systematic harassment of property owners throughout the county." Stevens had aged 10 years in the few hours since his arrest, his expensive grooming replaced by the hollow look of a man facing decades in prison. "I want to make a deal," he said finally. "I can give you information about corruption that goes much higher than you realize." "What kind of information?" Detective Cooper asked. "County commissioners, planning department officials, even the tax assessor's office." This development project involved bribes and illegal influence at every level of local government. As Stevens began detailing the web of corruption that had enabled the conspiracy, investigators realized that Esperanza's determination to save justice had exposed criminal activity that affected hundreds of families and millions of dollars in fraudulent transactions. Back at the hospital, Pastor Stone arrived with news that lifted everyone's spirits. The church and community organizations had established a legal defense fund for families affected by the fraudulent tax assessments, and a prominent environmental law firm had offered to represent them pro bono. The entire community is rallying. "Behind your family," Pastor Stone told Guadalupe and Sergio. "People are calling Esperanza a hero for exposing this corruption." "She's just a teenager who loves horses," Guadalupe said, though her pride in her daughter was evident. "She's a teenager who has the courage to fight injustice," Pastor Stone corrected gently. "That's exactly the kind of hero this community needed." Dr. Spencer arrived at the hospital in the late afternoon with updates on Justice's condition that brought tears of relief to Esperanza's eyes. "He's going to be fine physically," the veterinarian reported. "The rope burns will heal, and the muscle strain from struggling against his restraints will resolve with rest. But psychologically, he's been traumatized by the experience." "What does that mean for his future?" Esperanza asked, her concern for the Mustang evident in every word. "He'll need time to trust again. Wild horses have long memories, and the abuse he suffered will affect his behavior for a while." Dr. Spencer pulled up a chair beside Esperanza's bed. "But I think you might be exactly what he needs for his recovery." The suggestion sparked a conversation that would change Esperanza's life in ways she could never have imagined. Dr. Spencer explained that Justice would need specialized care and rehabilitation, work that required someone who understood his unique temperament and could help him overcome his trauma. "I'd like to offer you a position as my assistant," Dr. Spencer said. "Part-time while you finish high school, full-time afterward if you're interested. Justice needs you, and I think you have natural abilities that could make you an excellent veterinarian." The opportunity was beyond anything Esperanza had ever dreamed possible, but it also raised practical questions about her family's financial situation and her ability to pursue higher education. Garrett Ellis, who had been waiting patiently in the hallway, knocked on the door with news that addressed some of those concerns. "The school district called," he announced excitedly. "They want to nominate you for a full scholarship to the state university. Your investigation and the evidence you gathered impressed everyone, including some university professors who heard about the case." As the day progressed and more details of the conspiracy emerged, it became clear that Esperanza's brave actions had accomplished far more than protecting a single Mustang. Her investigation had exposed corruption that threatened the entire community's way of life and had given people the tools they needed to fight back. Wells Bradshaw, meanwhile, was learning that cooperation with authorities might be his only path toward redemption. Agent Martinez had offered him a chance to avoid prosecution in exchange for testifying against other participants in the conspiracy and providing complete financial records of the development project. "Your daughter's courage has given you an opportunity to do the right thing," Agent Martinez told him. "The question is whether you'll take it." As evening approached and the desert sky painted itself in brilliant oranges and purples, the community of Sunset Ridge began to understand that they had witnessed something extraordinary. A 16-year-old girl's love for a wild Mustang had exposed injustice, brought criminals to account, and given everyone hope that ordinary people could still make a difference in an often complicated world. 6 months later, the morning sun painted the restored canyon in shades of gold and amber as Esperanza made her way up the familiar trail to the springs where her life had changed forever. Her ankle had healed completely, leaving only the memory of that terrifying day when she and Justice had both been prisoners of human greed and corruption. The canyon looked different now, protected by federal legislation that had grown out of the criminal investigation. The illegal survey stakes had been removed, the springs flowed freely, and the wild Mustang herd had returned to their traditional grazing areas. Most importantly, Justice was waiting for her at their special place, as he had every morning for the past 3 months. The magnificent stallion stood at the water's edge, his coat gleaming with health and his spirit restored to its natural wildness. The rope burns had healed without scarring, but the deeper wounds of trust had taken much longer to mend. Esperanza approached slowly, speaking in the soft voice that had first calmed him as a frightened captive. "Good morning, Justice," she said, quietly stopping several feet away to let him decide whether to approach. "How are you feeling today?" The Mustang turned his head toward her, his dark eyes showing the intelligence and wariness that had kept his kind alive in the desert for generations. After a moment's consideration, he took 3 steps closer, bringing himself within arm's reach, but maintaining his dignity and independence. Dr. Spencer emerged from behind a cluster of boulders where she had been observing Justice's morning routine, her notebook filled with observations about his steady progress towards psychological recovery. "He's made remarkable improvement," she told Esperanza as they watched the Mustang drink from the clear springs. 3 months ago, he wouldn't let any human approach within 50 feet. Now, he actively seeks your company. But he's still wild. Esperanza observed with satisfaction. That's what matters most. The rehabilitation process had taught both human and horse about healing, patience, and the delicate balance between connection and freedom. Esperanza had learned to provide comfort and care without trying to possess or control, while Justice had slowly rediscovered that not all humans meant him harm. Their work together had become the foundation of Esperanza's future. The university scholarship had been confirmed, with a special program that allowed her to complete her pre-veterinary studies while working part-time with Dr. Spencer. The arrangement provided both practical experience and financial support for a family. Guadalupe appeared on the trail below, climbing steadily toward the springs with a thermos of coffee and the calm confidence of a woman whose life had been transformed by recent events. The criminal investigation had revealed that her family's property taxes had been fraudulently inflated by over 400%, and the restitution settlement had provided financial stability they had never known. "The reporter from the Phoenix newspaper is here," Guadalupe called out as she reached the springs. "She wants to interview you about the scholarship program for other young people affected by the corruption case." The story of Esperanza's investigation had spread far beyond Sunset Ridge, inspiring similar efforts in other communities where development companies had used illegal tactics to acquire land. Her courage had become a symbol of how ordinary people could challenge powerful interests and win. "I still can't believe they want to interview me," Esperanza said, accepting the coffee her mother offered. "I just did what needed to be done. That's exactly why your story matters," Dr. Spencer replied. "You showed that caring about something bigger than yourself is worth any risk." The sound of approaching vehicles drew their attention to the trail, where a small convoy was making its way toward the springs. Sheriff Douglas led the group, followed by Pastor Stone and several members of the county commission who had been elected to replace those convicted in the corruption scandal. Commissioner Elena Rodriguez, no relation to Esperanza's family despite sharing a surname, had requested this morning's visit to see firsthand the canyon that had become the center of such important changes. She was a former teacher who had run for office specifically to ensure that government served all citizens, not just wealthy developers. "This is beautiful," Commissioner Rodriguez said, as she took in the peaceful scene of the springs, surrounded by natural vegetation and wildlife. "I can understand why you fought so hard to protect it." Sheriff Douglas had aged considerably during the months of investigation and trial, but his expression showed the satisfaction of a lawman who had seen justice prevail against difficult odds. "The final sentencing hearing is next week," he told Esperanza. "Mark Stevens will receive 15 to 20 years in federal prison. Wells Bradshaw's cooperation earned him community service and probation, but he's also required to fund wildlife protection programs for the next decade." The legal resolution had been more satisfying than anyone had dared to hope. Stevens' testimony had led to the conviction of 12 county officials for bribery, fraud, and conspiracy. The development company had been forced to pay millions in restitution to affected families, and new oversight procedures had been implemented to prevent similar corruption. Pastor Stone approached justice with the respect due to a creature who had played a crucial role in exposing the truth. The Mustang allowed him to come close, though he remained alert and ready to move away if necessary. "In some ways, justice saved our entire community," Pastor Stone observed. "If Esperanza hadn't been determined to protect him, the corruption might never have been discovered. He saved me too," Esperanza added quietly. "When Stevens was threatening us in the mountains, justice put himself between us and danger. He protected me when no one else could." Dr. Spencer had been documenting this conversation for her ongoing research into human-animal bonds, particularly the unique connection between Esperanza and Justice that had developed from their shared birthday. During that long-ago thunderstorm, the timing of their births was remarkable, she said, addressing Commissioner Rodriguez. But what's even more remarkable is how that connection grew into something that benefited an entire community. As the morning progressed, other members of the community arrived to see the restored canyon and hear updates on the ongoing legal proceedings. Garrett Ellis brought his younger sister, who was writing a school report about environmental protection. Mrs. Foster arrived with several of her students who were participating in a new wildlife monitoring program. The changes in Sunset Ridge extended far beyond the canyon itself. The exposure of the corruption had led to increased civic engagement, with record numbers of citizens attending county meetings and volunteering for community organizations. The Flores family had become symbols of how determination and courage could overcome seemingly impossible odds. Brooke Bradshaw arrived on horseback, riding a gentle mare that her father had purchased as part of his effort to rebuild their relationship. Her boarding school experience had been replaced with enrollment at the local high school, where she was working with Esperanza on a joint project to establish permanent protection for the wild Mustang herds. "Dad's meeting with the federal wildlife officials this afternoon," Brooke announced as she dismounted near the springs. "He's donating the entire canyon area to be managed as a permanent wildlife preserve." The news brought smiles to everyone present, representing the final piece of ensuring that Justice and his kind would never again face the threat of development pressure. Wells Bradshaw's transformation from adversary to advocate had surprised everyone, including his own daughter. "People can change," Esperanza observed, watching Justice graze peacefully near the water. "Sometimes they just need to understand what really matters." As the sun climbed higher and the morning grew warmer, the group began to disperse, each person carrying with them a sense of having witnessed something important about justice, community, and the power of individual courage to create change. Esperanza remained by the springs with Justice, their daily routine of connection and mutual respect continuing as it had for months. The Mustang had taught her that wildness and trust could coexist, that protection didn't require possession, and that some bonds transcended the ordinary rules of human and animal interaction. Dr. Spencer gathered her equipment and prepared to return to town, where she had a full schedule of veterinary calls and administrative work related to the new wildlife protection programs. "Same time tomorrow?" she asked Esperanza. "Justice and I will be here," Esperanza replied, running her hand gently along the Mustang's neck. "We have a lot more healing to do together." As the veterinarian walked away down the trail, Esperanza sat on her favorite rock overlooking the springs, where 16 years earlier, during a violent thunderstorm, two lives had begun their journey toward this moment of peace and purpose. Justice stood nearby, free to leave whenever he chose, but content to remain in the company of the young woman who had risked everything to protect him. The canyon around them buzzed with the sounds of wildlife that had returned as the threat of development disappeared forever. In the distance, the town of Sunset Ridge carried on its daily business, forever changed by the events that had begun. With a teenage girl's determination to save a wild Mustang, the corruption had been exposed, justice had prevailed, and a community had learned that ordinary people possessed extraordinary power to protect what they loved. The bond between Esperanza and Justice continued to grow stronger each day, built on respect, trust, and the shared understanding that some relationships transcend the boundaries between human and animal, between civilization and wildness, between what was and what could be. As the morning sun reached its full strength, casting the canyon in brilliant light, both girl and horse stood together in the place where their lives had intersected, content in the knowledge that they had found their purpose in protecting each other and the wild place they both called home. The end. Up next, two more incredible stories are waiting for you right on your screen. If you enjoyed this one, you won't want to miss this. Just click to watch, and don't forget to subscribe. It would mean a lot.